Hello and welcome to this edition of 30 Mechanical Minutes, virtual content for real-time professionals. My name is Doug Picklick, editor of HPAC Magazine, and the topic for today's session is Spring Startups in a COVID World. This session is being sponsored by NABAC, manufacturer of a portfolio of tools, gauges, detectors, charging machines, and vacuum pump and recovery units for the HVAC industry. Thank you for your support. I'm joined here today by regular HPAC Magazine contributor Ian McTeer, along with Gary McCready from HVAC Know-It-All. First, a little background on my guests. Ian has been a longtime writer for HPAC, and he's also an HVAC consultant and retired field service representative with over 35 years of experience in the industry. He was a field rep for Trane Canada and is a refrigeration mechanic and Class 1 gas technician. Gary is a Toronto-based licensed refrigeration and gas technician and an online sensation with a very active social media presence, bringing both education and entertainment to the HVAC industry. Starting on Facebook, he now has a massive following on all social media channels, his own website, and a regular podcast, the HVAC Know-It-All. Welcome, guys, and thanks for joining us. I want everyone to know that both Ian and Gary are joining us by phone today. Ian is at his home in Eastern Ontario, and Gary's on the road. It's another work day. So again, thank you guys both for calling in and being part of this broadcast today.
I appreciate it, Doug. I appreciate the invite.
Thanks, Gary.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, between our two guests, we have many years of on-site experience. So for all of our listeners, if you have any questions, please type them into your on-screen panel, and we'll try to get to all of them before we sign off. And we are going to try to keep this to 30 minutes today. So please, if you have questions, send them in, and we'll get to them. Well, it's just past 2 o'clock in Ontario, where we are, and word has it our premier will be announcing further lockdown measures for the province. So many of our Ontario attendees may have a split screen on right now, and I would understand that. But it's also officially spring in Canada, and it's time to ramp up cooling systems, both in homes and commercial buildings. Ian, I'm going to start with you. I know every HVAC maintenance technician has a checklist to follow, but I wanted to know what are the first maybe 2 things to be done when going on a residential spring maintenance call in 2021, aside, of course, from wearing a mask.
Well, Doug, having never experienced being in the service industry under such conditions as COVID-19, I can understand it must be very challenging for technicians in the field. So my comments are largely based on my own experience, but I always thought the very first thing the technician needs to do is to talk to the homeowner, find out how the system's been working. I mean, were there funny noises, unusual odors, system failures during the heating season, and how are they resolved? Because of course some heating issues can of course lead to cooling problems as well, because one of the oldest rules of thumb is that if you can't heat a building, you'll never cool it. So that interview with the homeowner is fairly important, and you want to get as much objective data as possible. But I know that homeowners can be very subjective. You know, they'll say, well, I just feel it doesn't work very well anymore. And of course, that's not particularly useful information, but nevertheless, take it with a grain of salt. Now, I know that sometimes homeowners may not be there, maybe someone's sitting in for them, or maybe they have taken a day off work, or perhaps it's a one of these modern systems with a smart home, and the tech is just using a code to enter the house, and there's no information at all. So the technician is then forced to use more traditional methods. Although some of the newer thermostats, the smart thermostats, especially on communicating systems that talk to the product and to the internet, they sometimes they can even send an email to the registered dealer with a list of issues, and perhaps the tech already has that information uploaded, which would be great, but I'm not sure how many systems there are like that. So if there is a smart thermostat on the wall, that should be your first visit. Have a look at it, go into the information section, see if you can find any information on cycle rates or alerts or any type of codes that have been generated. Of course, make note of those. And that's essentially you're off and running then. So again, if there's any fault codes or cycling data in there, that's what you want to look for. And then of course your next step, in my view, and many service technicians that I know of, they often want to start with the outdoor unit, which I think is a mistake essentially, because any numbers that you get out there could be skewed by the fact that the indoor system is not working properly. So you want to go find the air handler. Of course, the first thing you're probably going to check is the air filter. You should be looking at the blower wheel, making sure it's clean. The evaporator coil you might have to inspect. Of course, it depends on how old the system is, and if your company has done work on that house before, you may have a service history on the unit. So, if the filters have been maintained properly and that sort of thing, you may not have to get into, highly investigative work, especially if the homeowner says something like, the master bedroom isn't cooling very well. That could be one of those issues where you're going to have to. That's a systemic issue that may require an additional service call, or you doing a thorough cleaning depending on your company and how much time they allow you on each startup. A thorough cleaning of components may well go a long way to solving that problem.
Right.
So, anything that requires major cleaning may require you to schedule a follow-up visit. And of course, inside you want to document everything that you can. You want to take a look for improper installations and needed repairs, that sort of thing should all be documented as well. So essentially, I think that's what you're going to do right off the bat is spend some necessary time inside the house, talking to the homeowner, gathering data, and dealing with the air handling unit.
Okay.
Doug?
And Gary, what about a scheduled commercial maintenance call? What's the first move in the spring of 2021?
I just want to know if you can hear me properly, because I switched to a headset just because Kate said she was hearing an echo. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you perfect. Thanks, Gary.
Awesome. So, I sent you that article over yesterday. This more pertains to service calls, but as far as maintenance goes, it can pertain to maintenance as well. And Ian covered a lot of that. And customer communication is number one, as far as I'm concerned, because the customer knows their equipment. Not the best, but they know when odd things are happening, like weird sounds or smells, or it's not cooling or heating the way I think it should. So that's really important. I like to start a maintenance with my senses, just looking at things visually, like, is the filter clean? Is the coils dirty? Are there broken fan blades, contactors? Do we see some pitting in there? So I always like to start without any tools in my hand, just having a visual of that unit, right? And then going from there is when we test the unit. But as Ian said, we need to know, before we can test cooling, we need to know if that blower is working. So we need to start that blower up. We need to know if it's running in the right direction. We need to know if we have proper airflow, because without proper airflow, our AC side of things is not going to work properly. So that would be my next step after visually inspecting, making sure that blower is running, and then making sure that we have proper power to the machine, because without that, I mean, we can actually, sorry, can I go back a second, because I messed that up. Verifying power
Yeah.
is here's the entertaining part. When we go live, I messed up. So verifying power comes before checking that blower, because if we don't have the proper power, the blower's not going to run properly. So making sure that your line voltage into the machine, your primary voltage is correct, and making sure that your control voltage is correct is very important. Then we come to that blower. As I said, make sure it's running properly, make sure it's moving in the right direction, make sure we have airflow. And then we get into the full diagnosis of the system after that, right? And then we know if it's running properly. So there's some steps. Once you get to a certain point in your career, there might be some things that you can bypass, because you know if you start that cooling up, it's not running properly. Maybe it's the blower that's causing the problem. Let me check on that. But I would say if you're starting out, if you're getting used to troubleshooting and maintenance, you go through the steps: customer communication, have a visual, make sure there's proper power, make sure the fan or pump, because it could be a pump if it's a chiller, make sure they're running correctly, and then go into your full sort of checkout of the system from that point.
Right. Okay, awesome. Okay, now obviously this past year has been unlike any in our lifetimes. Along with the pandemic, there's been a much greater interest in indoor air quality. Um, Ian, how does a technician address this issue with homeowners? In your opinion, I know you said you didn't live through this, but what are your thoughts?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've been around for a long time, and I remember when electronic air cleaners first became a thing in residential forced air systems. And one of the mistakes that salespeople used to tell homeowners at the time is that you'll never have to dust your house again. And of course, that just turned out to be a very bad thing to say, because of course a lot of the particles that the air cleaner was supposed to clean never even made it to the air cleaner. So this sort of thing may apply with COVID as well, because I mean, I've been reading a lot of industry generated stuff, and I like to say that I follow authoritative sources. I mean, Robert Bean, another HPAC contributor and an ASHRAE distinguished lecturer, I mean, he's written a lot of material on it. And another fellow I follow, Allison Bales III from LinkedIn, and his Energy Vanguard, he's been publishing articles on this regularly. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of good information about whether the COVID is actually making it to the filter in a forced residential forced air system. We know it's spread, it's aerosol, spread by aerosols. Whether or not they can make the long journey through a return grill down into the return air duct and all the way to the filter is another story. And of course, homeowners probably think that maybe that's the job of the filter, and to some extent maybe it is. But in my estimation, the filter is its main 100% main job, or 99% main job, is to help to keep the equipment clean. A lot of people are urging things like MERV 13 filtration. I sort of wonder, if the virus is making it to the filter, then, who gets to change the filter? I mean, how do you go about handling a filter with dangerous viruses stuck in it? I'm not sure that that's a good idea. Now, I may be speaking out of turn here because I'm not a scientist or an engineer, but having handled many, many filters in my time and seeing what lives on them, it doesn't seem to me to be a good idea to encourage homeowners to go to that extent. But if they do want to, in my humble opinion, the trouble with MERV 13 in the average residential HVAC system is they're just going to cause innumerable problems with air handling. They're very restrictive. Their initial pressure drop in many cases is well above what the system can handle. And I think that probably a good solution for a homeowner who insists on better filtration would be to go with a bypass Hepa system, like a Amicare or Five Seasons. Canadian General Filters makes them, where the filter is literally taking air out of the duct system, filtering it, and putting it back into the duct system. What's good about them is that they don't affect the system static. So there's no, HEPA filter is not going to affect the air handling capabilities of the system. So that's one thing. There are other things that people are talking about, bipolar ionization devices. Now I've been reading some material about those. They do seem to be very, very effective, but some people are concerned about they're putting out some unusual chemicals into the air as well. So are we killing with kindness there? UVC lights, they've been around for several years. They are effective, and they do have issues there as well. The UVC light is actually dangerous, and you can't look at it at all. So they have to be properly installed, and I'm told that the bulbs don't last that long. They're typically a consumable item. Maybe you might get 2 years out of them, and I understand that they're fairly expensive. So, I'm just not sure what I would tell a consumer other than perhaps go with a bypass system for now, because some of the, unless the system, of course, there's probably some designers out there probably jumping all over me now, because the system can be designed with a MERV 13 filter that will work properly. But all I'm saying is a retrofit into an existing system I don't think is a good idea unless there's going to be a serious renovation involved and perhaps even a different air handler installed. So that may not be a comfort to a lot of homeowners, but that's one thing. And then, of course, there's standalone devices as well, which I've seen many people using that are effective at perhaps containing the virus. But once again, if you get a filter loaded up with viruses, who gets to deal with the spent filters? That would be my concern.
Very true.
Doug?
Yeah, Gary. How have these conversations changed on the commercial side? I know it can be a hot topic, as Ian suggested.
Yeah, I haven't had any customers reach out and ask about air purification devices. They are very polarizing in the industry at the moment, and as Ian was mentioning, there's some industry people that are looking down upon them at the moment. But I mean, the three main factors really of indoor air quality are humidity, ventilation, and filtration. And if you can deal with all of those three things, you could probably get away with having some good air quality in your home. Now, I agree with Ian that the MERV 13 thing, now there's reports out there that MERV 13 is the minimum MERV capacity that you want to have in your system if you want to help with the health of human beings and not just the equipment. But you can't just throw it in and walk away and think everything's going to be good. You need to take a baseline with the previous filter that's in there, maybe partially loaded up or something like that, or even if it has to be clean, then do it with a clean one. And then you got to put the MERV 13 in and see if there's any changes to the system. I did this with a Liebert unit last week. The customer was asking about MERV 13, and they wanted to see if one would work in their Liebert system in the server room. Now, it is, people go in there once in a while, so that there is traffic. So I said, okay, I'll put it in, but I have to warn you that it may not work because it's more restrictive, as Ian was saying. So I put it in, or first I did the baseline with the MERV 8 that was in there, and then I put the MERV 13 in and did some readings, and there was some more, there was a bit of an air loss there, but not enough that I was scared to let it stay in the system, because this Liebert was moving a ton of air, and I think it can do well. And that's with a clean filter. So if we go back to the location in 2 to 3 months and it's loaded up, now I got to take another reading to see what's happening, because if it can't survive the resistance of that filter, then we're going to have to think about doing something else, stepping up the airflow or going back to the MERV 8, depending, right? So that's my take on it. Just before you slap a MERV 13 in there, just make sure the system can handle it. And as far as the indoor air quality, ventilation is very important. At my home, I've got an HRV. With it off, the CO2 in the home is around 1,100 parts per million. Now it's recommended we're below 1,000. With it running, I'm in the 700 range, and I can feel a big difference in the air quality in the home with the HRV running. So that's sort of my take on it, and I think more commercial buildings should start implementing HRVs/ERVs as well, because I think it'll really help with that air quality.
Makes sense. Yeah. Well, guys, now we also all maintenance guys, you have a checklist of things, as we mentioned, that you go through. And I was just wondering if we kind of talked about what are the first 2 or 3 things that you do when you go on your spring maintenance call in 2021. It's a pretty long list, though, I assume, and I'm just wondering if there are 1 or 2 essential items that really shouldn't be missed, but sometimes maybe they are in your experience. Gary, maybe I'll start with you on this one, if there's 1 or 2 things you could think of.
Yeah, for me, I'm huge on the there's debate on whether these are called sheaves or pulleys, but I call them pulleys. I think stuff like this is missed quite a lot, and bearings and stuff on a blower system. If the pulleys start to wear, the belts are going to start to sit deeper. They're going to become worn faster, and the machine's not going to operate the way it's supposed to. So I'm a big proponent of checking pulleys and grabbing hold of shafts of blower wheels and motors and moving them back and forth and making sure there's no play, because even a little bit of play, that started for some reason. Why did that start? Is the belt too tight? Perhaps. Is something not set up properly? So I'm a big fan of checking those fan drives, because as I said before, if the fan doesn't run, nothing else works properly. So I think pulleys, bearings are overlooked, and possibly belt tensioning and doing it properly. I just actually bought one the other day, a belt tensioning tool that tells you if the belt is tensioned correctly. You got to look on a chart and line up a bunch of things, but I think it's really important that these things get checked periodically to make sure that your blower is going to continue to run the way it's supposed to.
Right. Awesome. Ian, are there some things on a residential maintenance call that maybe are being overlooked that are essential?
Well, technicians working on, perhaps they're a dealer for a dedicated HVAC line, or maybe 2 dedicated lines, and they've taken training on the equipment. They understand how it works. Maybe their company did the commissioning on the system and they've got some data to go on. I think they might have an easier time of it on the maintenance, perhaps get through it a little more quickly. It's the technicians who service all makes or whatever comes, I think, have a tougher time and are more likely to miss things, because you really have to have a tremendous range of knowledge, especially with the new higher SEER models. I think what often gets overlooked is technicians take some data, but they don't necessarily compare it with the manufacturer's data for expected performance under the conditions that they've measured on that particular day, because the manufacturer will say, well, your suction pressure should be plus or minus 3 of what this chart says, and your head pressure should be plus or minus 10 of what this chart says. So if you're taking the data, but you're not comparing it to the manufacturer's data, you really don't know if that system is working well. The customer has bought a 20 SEER unit. There's no way to measure SEER in the field.
Right.
other than to make sure that your data coincides with what the manufacturer says that you should have, because you know, the days of the beer can cold suction line are long, long gone. So that's one thing. And of course, the other thing that gets missed a lot, in my opinion, is that data just doesn't get recorded or left behind, so that other technicians can use it in the future, even from the same service company. So, and I think I provided on one of the slides there. Maybe you can show that, but there are all kinds of forms. I'm sure certain contractors, you know, have their own forms and job tickets and that sort of thing. And I know that many of these test tools, Testo and Yellow Jacket and those people, they'll actually make system reports that you can email to the customer. For example, I know my man-tooth gauge will do that. So that kind of thing, I think, is essential. And that one form that I showed was developed by Trevor Matthews at Copeland. So, I mean, these data collection forms are out there, and they should be used and they should be left behind. So, I think that's very important as far as maintenance.
Okay, we're nearing the end, but I wanted to ask for sure about kind of today's more digital appliances, and everything's more connected. And I'm just wondering how that kind of, the more information that these appliances are able to give you, how is that changing the maintenance call for you guys? Gary, maybe I'll start with you on that one on the commercial side.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the buildings that I currently take care of have building automation. They're basically it's an add-on to the existing equipment that automates the building. And what I find is the trend logs, the history going back that it records is very valuable information, because a lot of times you don't know what happened before you got there. I mean, you can guess, but a lot of times you're not going to know what happened. So there's been times where you can actually use these trend logs, or I've used these trend logs in my personal experience to actually troubleshoot an issue, and then go to the machine and just verify that my diagnosis was correct. So, for instance, this is not a this doesn't pertain to cooling; it pertains more to refrigeration. But the example is parallel. I was working on a small chamber that's refrigerated, and after the defrost cycle, it wasn't holding box temperature. And I looked at the trend log, and I could see that it came out of defrost and the box temperature never went back to normal. Now, it provides a hot gas off the discharge line to defrost the coil, and there's a solenoid in between. So the solenoid in between, I'm thinking, well, there's got to be some flow bypassing internally to keep that evaporator warmer than normal, because it happened like a snap of a finger. It wasn't gradual. It was working normally in a defrost, out of defrost, it wasn't working normally. So I took that solenoid apart, and inside I found it was worn and it wasn't seating properly, and it was bypassing flow. It was changed and it started to work properly again. So that's where trend logs and information that a system that's smart collects that you can use to your advantage.
Right. And Ian, I think you kind of touched on this earlier. These smart thermostats and the appliances that they're connected to now.
Yes, that's right, Doug. And as I said earlier, some of them even have the ability to communicate this data to a dealer who's been registered with that particular unit. And some of the newer outdoor units, they have user interfaces, or perhaps a handheld with a mini split system that will communicate all kinds of data, all this stuff that you would have to take manually. A lot of the newer units have pressure transducers in them now, so you don't even need to hook up gauges anymore. You can just read a DC voltage off a control board, that sort of thing. I really like that stuff, but I think that the market is probably at this point 90% not that. So is still a good old fashioned method of hand cranking out and taking this data with you know, temperature, measuring temperature and voltage. As Gary mentioned in his very first comment, how important voltage is
Right.
to all these appliances. So that's, I'd like to see more of this stuff come to the residential side, but the units typically are costly. And as I mentioned in my spring tune-up article in HPAC magazine, that you know, we've only got like 700 or 800 cooling load hours in Ontario. So
Right.
I think perhaps with the limited use, people aren't really going to buy that stuff left, right, center.
That's very true. Okay, gentlemen, we do have a couple of questions that came in, so I want to get to them soon because our half hour is just about up. Kenny has asked, just wondering your thoughts on small air purifying filters that insert in the filters of ductless mini splits. Do they serve an effective purpose?
Well, I'll take that one. That's a good question. My experience with ductless mini splits is not all that great. I do know that they have a fairly good filtration system from the manufacturer, but you know, once again, capturing these organisms, these potentially dangerous viruses, I'm still out to sea on whether or not that's a good idea. I think we're going to have to wait for the experts to really help us on that one.
Right.
But
Yeah,
anything to provide better filtration, I'm for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gary.
I was going to say I agree with Ian. I just don't know enough about this to give a proper answer. So I think there's more testing. There's more in-field work that needs to be done with these things to know if they actually work correctly. So I'm going to stay away from that one because it's so polarizing. It's just I don't have enough experience to say yes or no.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I've got another question here from Mr. Jaworski. If you don't have a crankcase heater, is there anything else you can do? I heard before initial startup of the AC unit, tap the contactor just to jog the compressor a few times before actually putting the first call for cooling after the winter season. Anyone?
Yeah, I'll go. I mean, that's an old school trick that I was taught years ago is to bump the contactor, and a lot of people will despise anybody that bumps the contactor in the field. They say you shouldn't do it, but I've done it in the past because from what the old school mentality that I was taught back in the day is there's any liquid in there, a little bump should get some of that liquid out, but there's really no way of telling if that liquid is out of the compressor. There's really no way of telling. A crankcase heater will help to boil any liquid migration out of the compressor. Having a solenoid, having a pump down system, a recycling pump down system will ensure that if there's any migration on the off cycle, that low side pressure rises up, it will go into pump down and shut off on low pressure. So it's always making sure there's no liquid refrigerant in there. There's some drawbacks to that because it might pump some oil out every time it does that. If you have internally bypassing valves like a solenoid, if it's internally bypassing, or compressor valves, it can cause it to recycle quite a bit. The other thing that people do is if it's not a pump down system, they'll stick a liquid solenoid valve that powers with basically when the compressor powers up, the solenoid powers up. When the compressor powers down, the solenoid powers down, so there's no sort of liquid migration coming back down that liquid line to the compressor. So those are some options you can use if you don't have a crankcase heater, but crankcase heaters are cheap. They're not expensive, so that is your most inexpensive and most effective way to prevent that from happening.
Preferred over the tap?
Oh yeah, preferred over the tap, yes.
Yeah, okay. I just want to say Todd Button says, hi, Ian.
Hello, Todd.
There you go. And
Hey,
this is our
haven't
one
seen
last
Todd in a long, long time.
this is our one last question.
Hope all is well.
Do you feel that duct cleaning is helpful, useful during seasonal changeovers? How often is duct cleaning necessary?
I took the last one, Ian. You can
Well,
go.
yeah, I think duct cleaning is a useful service. How often it needs to be done, I don't know, but I can tell you one time years ago when we were doing some work in this lady's home, and I had to take one of the sidewall return areas off, and it was just choked with dust. I hadn't seen anything like that before in my life, because typically when the air goes through the register, it has to make such a sharp turn that a lot of the particulates will drop out right there. So that's why you often find the area behind the return air grill is so dirty. But this one was like extra special, and the poor woman started screaming when she saw it. So, I mean, I do believe that duct cleaning is necessary from time to time. It's certainly industry experience that dictates how often it be done. In my own system here in my house, I'm 6 years in now, and I have a very good filtration system, so there's very, very little dust in it. So I wouldn't call for duct cleaning here, but you get people who have small businesses in their basements. I ran into a guy one time who was doing serging work with sewing machines. That the dust was just unbelievable. Things like that. Pets, people who have a lot of pets, pet hair and that sort of thing, it adds up, it gets into everything. So yeah, duct cleaning does help. And doing it at spring maintenance time if it's dirty, yeah, absolutely. Because the stuff could dislodge and end up getting into the system again. So by all means.
Okay. Okay. There's one more question. I'm going to ask it, and then we're going to go. And it's a bit of a long one, so please bear with me. You want to move a condenser, but you can't pump down the compressor. Service valve isn't closing properly. So you recover the refrigerant. What do you need to know so you don't damage that compressor that's now open to the atmosphere? Am I okay to purge nitrogen through the compressor when brazing? What about flushing through the compressor with RX11? Thank you.
I have experience with RX11 flush. It's a good product, but I don't know how healthy it is for you to breathe in. So I would recommend using nitrogen while brazing, because it's been shown many times, fittings cut apart, that there's zero carbon inside if you do it properly. So yes, nitrogen, use nitrogen when brazing 100%. But if you want to protect that compressor, it being open to the atmosphere, maybe just cap those lines while you're working. And when you're brazing them in, use nitrogen. But you need to pull a very good vacuum. Make sure you have a micron gauge on the system, and come down below 500 microns and make sure it holds there. And also put a filter dryer in after you're done moving that system, because the filter dryer will make up for anything that you may have missed, because we're not perfect. Nobody's expecting you to be perfect out there. Just do your best. That filter dryer is going to help as well.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Gary,
especially with 410A.
okay. Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Ian and Gary. We've come to the end. I'm glad we could make this work today. Thanks for calling in. Gary, thanks for calling in from the road. We really appreciate your time. And I want to say thank you again to NAVAC for sponsoring this edition of 30 Mechanical Minutes. And until next time, I'm Doug Picklick, and that's a wrap. So thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Doug.